Writers Guild, I think they authorized a strike, what was it, like 3 weeks ago? And I had talked to people at that time. I have a lot of friends, obviously, in the Writers Guild Union and in the Writers Guild. The Writers Guild Union. The Writers Union or the Writers Guild. And they were pretty skeptical, like 3 or 4 weeks ago when the vote authorization happened. Because in the past, like when the last strike was, I guess, in 2008 or 9, we got to the deadline. They extended a little bit before they went on strike. They did not do that this time. They were not messing around. And it feels like, to me anyways, I don't remember what the strike authorization vote was 12 years ago, whenever it was. No, 15 years ago. 15 years ago. I don't remember what the strike authorization was, but this time it was something like 89% of like 85% of people who participated in the vote. I mean, so it was pretty high this time. And again, a lot of these writers are, the type to be not quite union-y. Or at least some of them back 15 years ago.
Yeah, I'm curious, like relative to 15 years ago, do you think like the mood is different now?
I think the mood is different, and this is complete. I'm outside of that business. I know people, but I think the mood is different, not just amongst the writers, because you have younger people in there who have like a higher, like all the reasons that Jane McAlevey was telling us. But I also think that the actors, I think like the people who rely on the writers, they are also have a different perspective towards this.
More united.
And I think even like, the people who are going to get hurt the most by this, in addition to the writers, but the people who are ultimately going to get hurt by most about this, going forward, depending on how long it lasts, are going to be people working on crews. Right. I mean, who go gig to gig, and that has the chance to hurt them. What's going to be really interesting, and here's a clip of the Writers Guild, and we'll talk about the potential different things. This is a video posted from the More Perfect Union's Twitter account. This is from yesterday, and this is a video about why the Writers Guild are going on strike.
Economic pillars that our industry have been built upon have, in the last decade, been turned on their head.
Television writers are being paid less money for these complex, multifaceted, unique narratives that bring companies like Warner Bros., Disney, and Netflix billions upon billions of dollars every year. And now, writers are understandably at their limits. And soon, that could affect you.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Right now, Hollywood writers are in a heated contract dispute with the 9 largest production studios. At the center of that fight is something called residuals, one of the most important ways that writers get paid.
Residuals are payments that are made every quarter by the companies to the writers for the content that they create.
The WGA contracts that currently exist were built upon a model where the content providers generated the revenue through ad sales. So if I write an episode of television that re-airs over and over and over again, every time that episode re-airs, the content provider generates revenue, and a little piece of that revenue gets shared with everyone that contributed to the creation of it. Now, their revenue is made almost exclusively through monthly or annual subscriptions. So there is no re-airing. People can watch what they want when they want, which means that we're not getting the same residuals that we once would have.
What I'm accustomed to as a broadcast writer, as a residual, like $20,000 for an episode of TV, in streaming, I just got a check for the same project for $23. And what's happening a lot is that at a certain point, after a certain couple of years, a streamer has to continue paying residuals, and instead of doing that, they much rather just pull the product from their app. And so that's what we're seeing a lot of. Content that we create 5 years from now, completely gone, and we are not getting any residual compensation out of it.
So if you have a favorite show that you loved that you can't find anywhere anymore, it's because those content providers don't want to pay the creators of the show for the right to air it.
Remember when HBO...
And, look, the bottom line is the older contracts, the business was the payments were based upon the expectation that shows could have a life in sort of secondary, tertiary markets, even more, and that's the way you get paid. And then when that dries up, you need a commensurate change on the front end, if that's the way you're going to do it. And they're not, and of course, that's what this is really ultimately is about. I mean, the old model doesn't work. And as this thing is transitioning, the studios are making all the cash. Mm-hmm. But I just think what's going to be interesting to see now, the thing to watch is, and I know SAG, I just got an email about it. There's, people going down and picketing with the writers. But what's going to be interesting to see, and I don't think there's going to be too much pressure to do this initially, but what's going to be interesting to see is if writers, I should say actors, directors, production unions, if they decide, you know what, we're not going to do the productions. Because if a show is in production now, let's say, for instance, let's say Hugo's hot dogs. Mm-hmm. It's a fictional animation. There's like probably at least 2 or 3 scripts that are already done. The animation hasn't happened, but we got to go in and record it for Hugo's hot dogs. Maybe there's 2 or 3 that are, pretty close to done, or at least 1 or 2 or that are probably definitely done. The question becomes then, do the actors go in and record it? I would say if the record was going to happen, today or tomorrow or, all this week, definitely they're going to go in and do that. You got a lot of production people who are relying on that. But if the strike continues another week or 2, you may start to see other unions decide like, hey, we're not even going to work on the product that already is out there.
Well, is Hugo's Hot Dogs a Fox show still, or is it on it's a Netflix original or something?
Same stuff.
Is it? But my central question, I need to read more about this, is I understand from the residuals for re-airing of the episodes is really hurting people's pay here, but are streaming services also gigifying their pay on the front end in addition to the fact that the traditional model has been undercut? Are streaming services like Netflix and Amazon even worse offenders than the traditional network show? I don't know. By the time the last script I wrote was for AMC, and that was, I think, 11, 12 years ago. So I never wrote anything for a streaming outfit, but that seems central to the concerns here. I
think the concern is not, I don't think, the upfront pay as much as sort of like how you get it on the back end. And the only other issue that is also changed is that the way that they order TV shows in this era is different. You used to I'm going to get a 9 or 12 episode order, and that's locked in. I think these streaming ones do it shorter, and they do shorter seasons, and
they cancel shows as soon as they don't. I'm pretty sure that their algorithms model how long people are hooked into a show. And if people aren't watching it all the way through, or this isn't this like immediate kick with the show on the streaming service, they'll just cancel it immediately. So like there's less of the ability for these shows to have longer shelf lives. Like that happened with Lovecraft Country, right? That also happened with that other Netflix fantasy show. I would guess too that there's never been more TV content out there than ever before. Never ever.
Necessarily. I mean, that's the thing, is that we have mechanisms to replay these, and so
that also hurts them on the back end as well, because the market's so saturated and they're still using models from when there was a tenth of these programs for people to choose from.
Yeah, it's no coincidence that the last strike was 15 years ago, because 15 years ago, Netflix was not doing original content. All you had was HBO in terms of like it wasn't even a streaming service, but it was like similar in the sense that it would just, you could, wasn't even fully on demand maybe by that time. I can't quite remember, but it was a very different landscape than it is today. And
but I remember that, like, just as a consumer, and the quality was really bad when they tried to put out those shows without any of like the union labor behind it.
Oh yeah. They tried to do for a couple of nights. I think even like I feel like Jon Stewart did a couple of nights.
That's the knock on him, right?
There's a funny clip of Conan O'Brien recirculating when he just went out with Andy Richter and just was like, let me see how many times I could spin my wedding ring around. Like they were just
on the table.
They were just like messing around, just being like filling up time on the air.
And I also saw that.
But all of these shows this time, there was no controversy. Even Jimmy Fallon said immediately, like, we're not gonna do a show.
Good.
Right.
And I think part of it is there is just like this. We have a younger generation. They are much more sensitive to unionization, to these issues of workers. I would also say things like social media creates a lot more pressure to not be a scab. I also think, oddly enough, like the level of competition, the intensity is lower, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. This is just from my perspective from the outside. Because 20 years ago, there was like a nighttime, there was a late night king.
Right.
And then there was a couple of people trying to get there. And now there's like 43 late night shows, it feels like. Right? I mean, I'm not disparaging him. It's just like there is, the same thing with television. Like when I was involved in television, it was like, there were a couple of shows that you'd never heard of that had been on for like 10 or 15 years, and they were usually like a Friday night on ABC, and like, buried. Now there can be so-called hit shows. I never heard of any of them.
Yeah.
Like, and
I also heard that
it's not just because I'm out of it. Like this has been retold to me by other people.
I mean, I like watch something and then I like basically like things seem so transient now. Like I watch something and I'm like, oh, I guess I did see this. I don't remember it at all, but I started watching and was like, oh yeah, I enjoyed this like 16 months ago.
But that's why water cooler television is so much better. It sticks in your mind, like the Sunday releases on HBO. That will always remain, I think, king. But like Conan, to your point, Bradley, sorry to cut you off, but I also heard he paid all the salaries in full for his writers. Jimmy Fallon's like, I have no chance of doing the show if people aren't writing my jokes, so I'm not even going to try. And then I also saw a funny story, too, about how Steve Carell called in sick as opposed to coming in to do, like, the scab scripts by saying he had enlarged balls, which is a good... But go ahead, Bradley. Sorry.
I was just going to say, to your guys' point, like, I think you look at you look at some of the catalogs for these streaming services, and you almost wonder, like, there has to be a real discrepancy between the amount of eyeballs that can get on these things relative to the amount of titles there actually are. So it almost just seems like, regardless of, Netflix is obviously super, super obscure in terms of how they don't, release their numbers.
Obtuse.
Or obtuse, excuse me. They don't release their numbers. Unless they're like very cherry picked. For some shows, I imagine there's just a real disparity between production cost for those things and people actually watching them.
Well, but the other factor is not necessarily there is value for a Netflix or an HBO to have a show that's critically acclaimed, even if nobody's watching it,
Right, even just to
because
have the title there.
it presents it is a lost leader is what it's called, and that has been a long time sort of strategy. If you can get a show that gets you Emmys or whatnot, or has critical acclaim, or that has value. So we'll see. We'll be following this, and we'll hopefully talk to somebody if something if this continues.